Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Generous Futures, Revitalizing Spaces, and City Building. My name is David Amborski, and I'm the Director of the Center for Urban Research and Land Development at Toronto Metropolitan University. We're excited about today's panel, which delves into an issue I am very passionate about, and I can't wait to hear from the esteemed group we have assembled. Before we begin, I would like to start with a land acknowledgement. TMU is located in the Dish with One Spoon territory. Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee that bound them to share territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers who have been invited into this treaty in a spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank our lead sponsor for the series, TD Bank, for helping bring generous futures to all of you. We simply couldn't do it without them. We all know why we're here today. The root question we are tackling today is, what role does charitable giving play in reimagining cities? The plan is for the next 45 minutes is straightforward. After we have a chance to hear from each panelist and engage in conversation, I'll do my best to get the questions that are pre-submitted to the panelists for response and discussion. But first, I need to introduce the panel. Andrea Delzato understands that city building is as much about creating community as is about construction. As a member of the founding family of a leading condominium developer, Tridel Group, Andrea has been immersed in the residential construction industry for most of her life. She serves as the executive to Tridel for 25 years and is currently a company board of director. Andrea has always focused on driving innovation, helping to reimagine the way people live. This led her to start Concrete Cardinal, a research, innovation, and investment group that champions the well-being of communities, with special attention given to the experiences and voices of those who are not often heard. Welcome, Andrea. In addition to serving as the chair of Dream Community Foundation, Crystal oversees the marketing and communications for Dream and its 4 public entities, including design and vision of new projects. She is also responsible for all office, retail, residential, and industrial multifamily impact community marketing at Dream. She has marketed and sold the award-winning Canary District, a community that has transformed downtown Toronto's East End. Currently, she is working on Zibi, the largest urban development in the National Capital Region. Crystal is also currently involved in the West Don Lands affordable rental development, which will be one of Canada's largest affordable housing initiatives. A noted philanthropist, Crystal is involved in a number of charitable organizations in Toronto and beyond. Welcome, Crystal. Hila is Vice President, Social Impact at the Daniels Corporation, one of Canada's largest builders. She's responsible for corporate mandates and strategic initiatives that look beyond the bricks and mortar to ensure the social, cultural, and economic infrastructures of communities built by Daniels are as strong as the new buildings. Hila's passion for social change and community impact comes from her lived experience as a new immigrant to Canada at a young age and growing up in a vibrant social housing community in Toronto's inner suburbs. Hila is a fund holder at the Toronto Foundation and sits on the board of directors of Start to Finish, a national charitable organization committed to promoting the health and wellness of children in Canada throughout literacy and fitness education. Welcome, Hila. And lastly, Ray Williams. Ray is a financial services executive with more than 35 years of experience in global capital markets. His expertise is in debt capital markets, has held leadership roles in marketing, trading, risk advisory, and execution. Ray currently holds the position of Vice Chairman Financial Markets at National Bank Financial. In his role, he is responsible for facilitating engagements with strategic accounts. He is also a key contributor to affordable housing commitment and gives to various nonprofit and charitable organizations, such as 100strong.ca, an organization focused on changing the narrative around young Black boys. He is also the chair and co-founder of the Black Community Fund. Welcome, Ray. So you see, we've established a very esteemed and knowledgeable panel today, and we're going to start the discussion by having all panelists respond to the same basic question. Very simply put, we'll start with Andrea, then followed by Crystal. and Gila and Ray, the question is very simple. Why do cities benefit from philanthropy? Andrea, perhaps you could begin.
Sure, thank you, David. The word itself, philanthropy, is from the two Greek words, meaning love and humankind. And it's really about the love of people together in society. And in its earliest form, it was about addressing some of the societal issues by looking directly at the root cause. But in cities, we are just so quick to treat the symptoms because there's an urgency and there's an expectation. But it's really not a sustainable answer because cities on their own don't have the resources. They don't have the capital financially and intellectually. And I read once philanthropy can be thought of as the connective tissue between the public and private sectors. And it brings us together. The two distinct differences, I would say, is their appetite for risk can be a little less conservative than what you see with traditional investments. And also it can be this innovation engine, because when you've got some legacy organizations, yes, they're risk averse, but they also are not so patient with their capital and they want to see returns a lot sooner. And so philanthropy has the ability, I think, to look at long-term approaches to long-term challenges. And when you look around our city, there's not much that it hasn't touched. And now we're realizing that housing is the root of a lot of these other issues. So it's critical that we have it. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. Now let's turn to Crystal.
Thank you, Andrea. And I think exactly what Andrea is saying. Our cities are very complex and they require the roles of our government, our private sector, and our nonprofits to really create an inclusive city. Now, many amenities in our cities that we use every day are not fully funded by our governments and require a lot from the philanthropic community and private sector to contribute. Think about libraries, community centers, mental health access, affordable housing. Resources that the communities rely on to thrive and create a sense of belonging requires everyone's participation. And the philanthropic community has its own role to play, and it is also vital to help communities thrive. I find with philanthropic and nonprofits, it really powers people to come together to address issues, donate time and money to accelerate progress, and support the most urgent causes. I just want to give you an example. We're building a community that will be over 1,500 acres in Calgary, and there'll be about 30,000 new residents that will live there. So you have to imagine, what does that community require to thrive? And we were in search of a partner to help create a hub, and a not-for-profit organization wanted to develop a new school, which included communal sports training facilities, think about hockey, soccer fields, swimming pools, basketball courts, to daycare to senior care, all in one campus. And these type of endeavors require the role of government. So the government was very vital in funding schools. The private sector, which provides the lands, probably at discounts and investment strategies that let the nonprofit thrive, but most importantly, the philanthropic community. Without them stepping up in a major way, many nonprofits cannot kickstart and get organizations to start. So I think philanthropic, all roles, government, nonprofits, and the private sector really need to work together to help cities thrive.
Thank you, Crystal. Your thoughts on this, Gila?
Thanks, David. I mean, Crystal and Andrea have both touched on sort of the role of philanthropy when it comes to resources. What I'd like to touch on is the role of philanthropy in community. And often philanthropy and not-for-profits and foundations can get deeper into community than government and the private sector. We also find that philanthropy is often based on research and that long-term view that Crystal mentioned, that looks at solving challenges not of the moment, but more systemically. And that becomes critical in city building because we know the complexities, we know there are no quick fixes. And so that ability for philanthropy to take that long-term view, to take a systems view really rooted in research and relationships with community groups and other not-for-profits becomes critical in that role as that connective tissue.
Thank you, Gila. And finally, Ray.
Sorry about that. I'm not sure that I want to go last again, because it strikes me that, you know, the ladies before me have actually really hit the nail on the head in such a fine fashion. At the end of the day, you know, philanthropy does play a very substantial role in really providing flexible funding, if you will. It largely serves those most in need. And I've heard reference to the notion of collaboration, which is super important. And at the end of the day, what it does, as it speaks to cities in particular, is that it does fill gaps where there are substantial needs. And we see that time and time again. But I really do believe that when I see what is taking place, there's probably a bit of a change required from the more traditional philanthropic model. When we look at philanthropy, it is done in a very patriarchal, colonialist fashion. And I think there needs to be a greater amount of listening taking place to those who are the recipients of the largesse. So there are roles to be played by everyone, but I think some of the aspects of what we've traditionally seen certainly needs to change. But I fully concur with the statements I've heard from the different perspectives of the other panelists.
Okay, thank you to the entire panel on these opening comments. They've been very, very insightful. Now let's push this a little further. I have specific questions for each of you. So I'll ask you specific questions, but if someone else wants to jump in on the same question to add to it or have a different view, please feel free to do so. So first, Andrea, what are some of the top line opportunities and challenges you see for the builder development leaders in terms of charitable giving? Whoop, Andrea, you're on mute, sorry.
Thank you. I'd say a while ago, there was this opportunity to have charitable giving and philanthropy set you apart and give you a bit of a competitive advantage. And now that's not the case anymore. It's almost this social license to operate where there's an expectation, obviously, to do business in a responsible way and to show what you stand for. But of course, some of the circumstances, particularly in our industry, I think everyone has their challenges, make it very challenging. And when we look at the increasing construction costs, we look at the interest rates, part of the challenge is making the numbers work, obviously. And if we can figure that out, there's definitely a huge appetite for people within the industry to solve the problem that centers around them and meeting the expectations of CSR. And when it's strategic philanthropy, it's easy. When you think of something we did with the School of Construction, naturally solving the problem of a shortage of skilled trades with a lot of retirement and the silver tsunami, that's easy to justify and put confidence around what you're spending, but sometimes it's not so straightforward. And when it comes to these social driven initiatives, given the timeline also of our industry, which can be 8 to 10 years, as we know, when it comes from raw land to turning over homes, things change dramatically. So it's hard to assess future social initiatives, and it's hard to justify current. So there are solutions being created. I think Lend-Lease came up with a very robust methodology to kind of put a number to their social spend and the impact it's having. They ended up coming up with 36 million pounds, being $44 million US, and it measured things like the job creation, the affordable rents, the business mentorship. So putting those kind of measurements around it is helpful in actually implementing it. Another huge opportunity is now this understanding that there is a correlation to what all these other aspects of community building does to the actual physical community. And by having that shift, I think we're inviting a lot new thinking and a lot of new partners and funders. For example, even with the tightening of borrowing restrictions, we are seeing family offices, we are seeing high net worth individuals want to participate in the funding of projects and make good returns. Now, there are challenges, I would say, as well as these opportunities. Again, just like you've got greenwashing with our environmental initiatives, you've got to really strive to see the authenticity and enforce the accountability of some of these initiatives. Because if you look at, for example, Black Lives Matter, some of the commitments were just lip service, and they didn't actually they didn't actually translate into the dollars being spent that were offered. So we need to, I think, standardize the reporting and enforce the accountability. And I think some of the pressure that we're seeing on corporations results in this other opportunity, which is a bit of relief in the housing, because you're seeing corporations. The latest one I read about was controversial for some other reasons, but Nike, for example, has the 1803 fund. Phil Knight just put $400 million in it, and they're working on a community in Portland, a Black community that they are working at rebuilding and strengthening. And what they're focusing on three things. It was education, culture, and belonging in place. And they're looking at the place piece, not just as having private equity come in and throw a bunch of housing, but it's about designing the whole community for those people, because we know that just putting housing is not the solution. I think we've seen precedents in our own city where you put even affordable ownership inventory in place, and it's not sustainable because there's not that wraparound support. So I think those are some opportunities and challenges. And fortunately, we're learning together, but I think with the innovative part of it, we can fail fast and learn faster. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Andrea. Crystal, could you tell us the ways in which Dream Foundation partners with charities and nonprofits? How are your charitable investments supporting people and building inclusive cities? That kind of builds on what Andrea's last points were.
So we've been in the business of building better communities for over 30 years, and it's basically in our DNA. We've realized that developing communities cannot provide all the benefits and supports that communities require. And as Andrea was speaking about, there are risk tolerances and there are focuses on returns for a for-profit business. So building and providing homes, let's say, if you don't make enough returns, Ray would know, the bank will not give you a loan to fund and or develop, build your projects. So therefore, Dream knew that we needed to create another way to achieve our social impact. And that's why we created the Dream Community Foundation. And our charity is really dedicated to maximizing the most impactful social returns. And we focused on four main areas, which is health and wellness, skills training, inclusivity, and affordable housing. Now, we know we're not here to reinvent the wheel. We understand that there are many amazing nonprofits doing amazing work in all these areas. And that's why we partner with organizations with high impact potential and local organizations so that we can deliver effective, sustainable solutions. There are many ways that DCF is trying to make our communities better, and I'm going to start really grassroots. And I know Gila does a lot of work with Daniels in this area, but we work in many different communities across Canada, and we survey and assess the needs of our communities. So for example, in one of our communities, we noticed that we had higher rates of new immigrants, children, seniors. So we partnered with local charities to deliver programs such as free tutoring, homework prep, and after-school help, skill training classes from English lessons to finance lessons to grant writing, and to partnering with local communities where we would pick up seniors to go play games, exercise, and or go shopping together. And we found the feedback is that the community felt more supported and they felt like they were really getting to know everyone around them. But I'd like to go even one step further. And as I said before, one of our pillars is health and wellness. And we partnered with larger organizations, such as Women's College Hospital, where we had our senior leadership teams meet with their senior leadership team and doctors to speak about the research and findings that they had on aging in place and health and wellness. And it was a very interesting collaboration. It allowed hospital practitioners to understand how we built communities and how communities were developed. And they, along with us, helped us create strategies to create environments that were more suited for health and wellness. Now, we implemented a lot of our learnings in one of our projects, which is one of Canada's largest and most significant rental communities. Altogether, on this 12-acre parcel in downtown Toronto, there will be about 2,500 rental units, of which 30% of it will be dedicated to affordable housing, and 25% will be all barrier-free. And it's really a model of inclusive and true mixed-use community across the city. But the learnings from this previous partnership we had with another nonprofit helped us inform us on the size of the units, the amenities which we wanted to offer, the services that we were going to provide in the building, and how we were going to build out aging in place opportunities within this community. Now, what makes this unique is exactly what Andrew was saying. There is the nonprofit side with our foundation working with another nonprofit, but really this project in itself represents a much more innovative model, which is where the public-private partnership comes together between us, the private sector, the province of Ontario, the city of Toronto, and the government of Canada, and several large nonprofits. We all worked very collaboratively together to create this affordable housing and delivering affordable housing at scale. Now, we went through this development and rezoning process. I think Andrew just talked about it. A typical rezoning process, taking a raw piece of land and developing it, is about 8 to 10 years. And with this type of innovative partnership with the government, we were able to deliver this within 4 years. So zoning and building to 4 years. And we were able to kind of bring the nonprofits together to deliver these inclusive cities. So I really think that's how our foundation and our for-profit organization can really help build inclusive cities.
Thank you, Crystal. Very interesting. Now I'll turn to Gila. Gila, through your work at Daniels, how have residents and communities influenced the way in which development takes place? There's some of that at the end of Crystal's answer again, so the transition is fairly smooth. What lessons have you learned about giving back from the community?
Our work at Daniels in community building is very much rooted in community input. We've started to call some of this work listen and learn tours, where we actually have team members, including our president and CEO, Mitchell Cohen, meet with community organizations, community groups, grassroots groups, and really listen to their hopes, dreams, fears, anxieties about the development that's happening around them and in their community. And often those conversations really lead us to understanding the community needs and the gaps that Ray mentioned previously. Instead of that sort of traditional top-down approach of, you know, we're building here and here's what we think this community needs. We know increasingly in conversations around philanthropy, around real estate development, the importance of community voices, but also lived experience in setting priorities and agendas for that, for a neighborhood. And that has become really instrumental in our work. And I'll provide a few examples as well. Daniels has been working in the Regent Park community in Toronto's downtown east for the last 17 years. And philanthropy has played a critical role in both the delivery of sort of physical investments in the community, but also investments in the social fabric as well. When we had these community consultations in the early days of the revitalization, the residents would point to a document called the Social Development Plan that talked about the need for an arts and cultural center. And as we looked at the zoning bylaw, that space didn't actually exist in the neighborhood, partially because there was no funding for it. And it wasn't in the business plan for the revitalization. And so by creating the physical space for it through a rezoning with government support, particularly at the municipal level, the federal and provincial government stepped up with funding, as did the private and philanthropic sectors. So $24 million from government, $10 million from private philanthropy, corporations, individuals, families, foundations, to create now this arts and cultural center that is really the social and physical heart of the community. Fast forward a couple years and we hear from the community the need for spaces for active athletics, especially given how many youth were in the neighborhood. And so again, we as developers can create the physical footprint, but the funding to create the Regent Park Athletic Grounds came from the Maple Leaf Sports and Entertainment Foundation to the tune of almost $3 million. And big kudos to the MLSC Foundation for actually recognizing that the physical investment wasn't enough. So they fundraised an additional $1 million for programming, understanding that community groups and organizations would actually need funds to secure permits, to really activate that athletic facility. And really, philanthropy in Regent Park, I'd say, has been an evolution. You know, the Artscape Foundation, MLSC Foundation has played a role, and more recently, the United Way of Greater Toronto. And that was a really unique model where the United Way created a social impact investment fund where residents actually decided where the granting goes in participatory grant making. And I think that's a really important evolution as it relates to philanthropy in city building, where the community is not just determining the priorities, but actually allocating the funding. And so we're really excited about sort of the future of philanthropy as it becomes more participatory and community-led. And it's been really nice to see partners like the City of Toronto embrace that as well.
Thank you, Gila. The Regent Park development provides an excellent illustration. Ray, now over to you. Ray, could you tell us about the ways in which the Black Opportunity Fund is having an impact on city building? You know, how can people get involved, and what's at stake if we lose the momentum you've gained in that organization?
Yeah. So look, before I start that, I just want to, say kudos to what I've heard in terms of what's taking place. What Crystal said and stated around the nature of collaborative partnerships. I actually happen to know and use the Arts Center that Gila referenced for Daniels, because we do so for this little badge you see here is for 100strong.ca for our Black boys. So we have traditionally held our monthly meetings there. And this is so very encouraging to hear and understand that there is, certainly from where I sit, a consistent approach being created here that represents collaboration, because my fundamental premise in all of this is that we need to have collaboration, that it needs to be a whole of community. And so my encouragement hearing that you have a situation where at a federal level, at a provincial level, at a municipal level in particular, especially where housing is concerned, then with foundations and others, that collaboration is taking place in a bunch of different spaces. I just think it's absolutely brilliant. So it really does leave me feeling full and just really encouraged about what it is that all these three amazing ladies are undertaking with the different organizations that they represent. So I just wanted to make sure that the kudos was extended, and certainly my appreciation in that regard. So Black Opportunity Fund, simply put, we are really about improving the socioeconomic conditions for Black Canadians right across the country. Home ownership, as it turns out, is one of the fastest routes to economic empowerment and building generational wealth. And this is an area where Black communities, racialized communities, miss out way too often. And with the way that price appreciation has occurred, it puts those communities further away from even stepping on the ladder. And I'm pretty much aware of some of the programs that Daniels Corp, for instance, undertakes to help with that in terms of bridging. But we also understand that, reasonably speaking, the social determinants, health, housing insecurity, even affordable rent in safe communities also contributes in many respects to what might be deemed very negative socioeconomic outcomes for Black communities on a disproportionate basis. We see this all the time. So as Black Opportunity Fund, we're engaging in a number of important tables to raise awareness and address some of these issues. As a case in point, our Executive Director, Craig Wellington, is engaged with a group called BChat, which is a Black community housing advocacy group, which in turn has collaborations with the City of Toronto on the Confronting Anti-Racism, Anti-Black Racism Unit. But you've got organizations like OCASI, YWCA, CP Planning, I think it was Margaret's housing initiative. So these are all sort of like engagements where we're working at the forefront to try and address housing inequity. And one of the things I really understand and appreciate, I believe, is that we have different housing markets across Canada. There is no such thing as a housing market. It's housing markets in the way that there are different Black communities. It's not a monolith. And so we are trying to address, on behalf of Black Opportunity Fund, serving those Black communities across the country. And as I mentioned, housing affordability, and I'm not just talking necessarily about ownership, I'm talking equally so about just what is shelter more generally, and renting and getting access is super important. With regards to the momentum, look, 3 years ago, there was this global awakening. Everyone suddenly saw stuff that many of us from the Black community knew, experienced, understood. The George Floyd incident created that, but COVID itself really exacerbated the whole situation. And at that point in time, you really saw and understood how racialized communities were being impacted. And, the reality is that the shiny new thing that shows up, soon loses its luster. People's attention spans are short. One turns up, we hashtag that, a meme occurs, and we're ready to move on to the next hashtag. So it's super important to me that we as Black Opportunity Fund continue to advocate with purpose and to educate and provide important context about all that we're undertaking, not only currently, but also providing the historical aspect of things in terms of why it is important that we create economic inclusion of Black people who have traditionally been excluded. And I know there are many people who will hear this and like, well, what are you talking about? The reality is always very different when you're engaging those that are impacted rather than those that are looking on. I heard some really amazing, fabulous statements from both Crystal and Gila about, for instance, how philanthropy is being used and the way it's developing, which is participation from the actual donees. They are influencing the outcomes, and too often what we see occurring, notwithstanding really good intent, misses impact time and again, because the voices that should be at the table at the very outset, the voices who should be at the policy table helping guide and create, is not there. So we go back to the notion of, making sure that we have a situation that is in large part collaborative. So the importance of us continue to maintain momentum is just to ensure that we're deliberate, that the continued economic exclusion of Black people is not something that we continue to see, because the reality is, Black Canadians, along with First Nations folks, are at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder by any indicator you choose to look at. And that's, sort of really borne out very clearly when you come across situations like what we've just come through in terms of COVID. So the important things for us as Black Opportunity Fund is to ensure that we continue to advocate on behalf of Black communities across Canada. And I tell people consistently, if we're successful in this, it is not just for Black communities, it is for all of Canada.
Thank you, Ray. Very interesting issues you have to face. We appreciate your comments. Now we
David,
yep.
May
Sure.
I weigh in very quickly, because
Please do, yes.
Ray touched on something that we haven't explored yet, and it's the role of philanthropy in advocacy. And often, governments, private sector need to, have advocacy at the table to bring up, thoughts and perspectives that might not be popular opinion. And so it's a really important piece of philanthropy, I believe, to play that role as advocates, as a sort of somewhat neutral voice at the table that otherwise may not be there.
How do you get the seat at the table? That's the challenge. Yeah.
Well. So let me sort of tap in there. The reality about that is you need access by engaging with people who have access. and you make your case in a fashion that shows that there is value, that there is a value proposition in providing that access and providing that advocacy. I mean, I have 3 panelists here with me right now who actually getting the job done and showing, you know, without doubt that it is possible to get it done based on advocacy, based on engagement, based on collaboration. And the very fact that they're all engaged in some fashion or the other directly with those impacted by the work they're undertaking speaks about where that access could come from. So that would be my statement and takeaway on that.
But I shouldn't be weighing in too much here, but the issue is, Ray, I think you got a point here, is that the 3 women who have been speaking all come from a company. And because they come from companies doing development, they can have a seat at the table. But your organization is trying to get a seat at the table without having a leverage of being the developer on the project, which is probably more challenging.
It is without doubt. But again, like if I was to go back to the models that I'm hearing here, those models represent a situation where those with a seat at the table are engaging exactly organizations like mine, right? So that's the collaboration that is being sought. And this is the opportunity, like I said, to change the more traditional model that represents philanthropy, giving, and impact.
Great. Thank you. Let me come back to Andrea for another question at this point. Andrea, affordable housing remains a huge issue, of course, in our cities. What is your perspective on this challenge? You know, how are the various stakeholders influencing and helping to address it?
I'm glad you gave me such a small topic, David. I am really appreciative that you phrased it in a positive way, and because it's very easy to have a half, you know, the glass half empty conversation with this. But I echo Ray. I think there's a lot of room for optimism here, and I tend to think it's like building a building where you think nothing is going on when things are below grade, but it's actually the most important work that's being done that most people can't see when you're building those foundations. And I think conversations like today are part of that. So I think I also am very optimistic, and, you know, point to some signs that are, some are more subtle, some are brand, some are local, some are not even within our country. But something, you know, as simple as our own government having a federal housing advocate that is being able to call out where we have any weaknesses in the accountability of what we're implementing, I think is a step forward. I think the city's pilot, where we had the multi-unit residential acquisition program, because part of building affordable housing also is you need that other piece, which is preserving the affordable. And we know that we are losing them at a rate faster than we're building them. And there are other, I've seen examples where there's been some creative finance put in place with partners such as community land trusts, where they are able to also acquire buildings and preserve the affordable in their communities. And then the good news is I'm seeing funds that are specifically not just for affordable building, but for preservation. And some in New York I've learned about that are over $500 million. And the people investing, it's a wide array of investors, which is really lovely to see. And also picking up on what Crystal was talking about, the pillar of the health and wellness, even though it's a different model and the institutions are not as set up as they are in Canada, there's some examples where hospitals are the top 3 donors in some fundraising that nonprofits were doing, because they're seeing that it really just is complementary to their mission. And so they are working together, which is very positive. And of course, technology, you can't not talk about technology. So we're seeing the things that they're making their way, such as modular housing, such as 3D, even though they're still early and we have things to tweak around implementation. But you're seeing platforms that are allowing for crowdsourcing, whether it's connecting investors and developments, whether it's even finding ways to use financial contributions toward payments of rent and purchasing homes. And there's also, I think, more effort. This is actually a great example of the one I'm thinking of anyway, of a resident and using that voice to come up with an innovation. which was helping the community. And it was using the data from paying your rent towards your credit score and allowing you to climb that home ownership ladder. So those are good innovations that are stemming again from someone's personal experience. We're seeing different models. Again, like Crystal was saying, there's examples of different models where they are tackling multiple challenges with affordability, such as seniors and students, and pairing them together so they can have more magnitude and impact with one initiative. And I would say also, we've seen the in real life collaborations, such as what Gila is talking about. And I think to what we've all been touching upon, and Ray as well, the importance of who is at that table, for example. And there's a real shift that I'm seeing and hearing about from the imbalance of power when it comes to the donors and the beneficiaries. And we are starting to make sure that the voice that we're centering these initiatives and efforts on are the person that makes the most sense. And I think it's really coming a long way, and it's an evolution, I think, of some culture and mindset that is only going to take us to a better place. And then the other collaborations that I think are just as meaningful sometimes to get us to those in real life examples are the intellectual kinds. And when you see things like Future Cities Canada, and you've got TD, McConnell Foundation, Evergreen, that are trying to get, some of the thought leaders, but maybe even some unknowns, an opportunity to participate in finding creative solutions to these problems. I think more of that, because we know what we've tried so far hasn't gotten us to where we need to be.
Thank you, Andrea.
Thanks.
Crystal, another question for you.
Sorry, David, I'm going to jump
Sure,
in again
please
here. And I
do.
see
No,
that
that's
Crystal's
great.
got her hand up as well.
Okay.
I'll be very quick to maybe add a dose of controversy to this part of the conversation, to say that I think philanthropy has actually been largely absent from affordable housing. And there is more of a role for philanthropy in that sector. Traditionally, it's really been looked at to the private development community and the government, where in other sectors like healthcare and education, it is that whole of community approach that Ray described, but not necessarily in housing. And as we look at, the critical, frankly, the crisis around housing, that's where philanthropy, to me, needs to step in and, potentially support not-for-profits in accessing affordable rental opportunities to bring down those average market rents, or contribute to affordable housing funds that can be revolving and replenish as one family, uses a loan, pays it back, and that supports the next family. And so as we talk about philanthropy's role in city building, I think there are areas where philanthropy has done well and sort of fulfilled that mission. But I'd say in affordable housing and the creation of housing, it's been largely absent, and that's a huge, huge issue.
And I just do want to add that sadly, some of the exciting examples I cited, as I mentioned, were not local, but they do provide some kind of hope, because we're not all at the same place, and we're going to get there, but we need some examples to follow. And
I was going to add some hope. And like I said, with our foundation, one of the pillars is affordable housing. And what we're learning is a lot of these nonprofits, especially what Ray was talking about, is capacity issues. And they have the will and want and the clientele to serve and who can go in these affordable housing units, but they don't have the capacity to figure out the financing, the development. They can't go through that process. So our foundation actually donating to these organizations and helping them bridge that gap. So we might help them find financial solutions. We might help them through their development process, and then we may actually fund that gap until they get the financing in. So there are new solutions that, Gila, you're absolutely correct, that the philanthropic community can come in and step out to help bridge that gap for affordable housing until the nonprofits can take over and actually finance and develop their own affordable housing units.
Thank you, Crystal. That's a great lead into the next question I had for you. Obviously, there were people watching this webinar who want to know more about the approach of foundation initiatives. You already outlined some of that, but what are some of the issues, priorities that are most important to the foundation? You've issued that as very, but what tips or what advice can you give to people who want to partner with your foundation? How can you invite them? Who can you get to contribute?
Well, I think before I talked about the Dream Community Foundation is really focused on building inclusive communities and developing mixed incomes. And I talked about our pillars, and I'm going to reiterate it. It's health and wellness, affordable housing, educational skills building, and inclusivity. And that's really, really broad. And we wanted to keep it broad so that we can help deliver a large mandate. Now, I'm going to give you a specific example. I'm going to talk about Wood Green. Now, many of you may not know who Wood Green is, and they have been around for 80 years, and they are the largest social service provider in Toronto. They are also the largest non-municipal affordable housing provider and owners, and they manage over 1,000 units. They are also one of the largest organizations helping address senior care, which includes dispatching PSWs, Meals on Wheels. I think they've received over 50,000 crisis calls a year, and they're building out skills training centers, mental health counseling, youth counseling. And with Ray, they're building a partnership with Rite of Passage where they're helping young boys and girls find their roots. So everything about their mandate fit with ours. And as a foundation, I had never heard of them. So prior to COVID, they sent me a pitch deck and they asked to meet with me. And their executive director and their now past board chair came to meet with me and talk about the scope of work. Not only was I very moved, we as a foundation donated immediately as we knew that our objectives were aligned with each other. But I personally wanted to do more. I was so moved by the organization that I joined their board and wanted to better understand the social service sector in Toronto, as most of the pillars really fit with our foundation. Now, 4 years after spending time with the organization and during COVID, I really understood Wood Green's mandate and I wanted to help them develop and create more awareness because no one knew what Wood Green did. And together, I helped develop the Unmet Needs campaign, which was an aim to raise $25 million for people with unmet needs in Toronto. And those needs could be unseen, unhoused, unsupported, unemployed, and unwelcomed. And just recently, actually, the last year I've been working on something called the Unmet Gala, which is a play of the Met Gala, but it was really to help bring the philanthropic community together to generate awareness, to ensure that everyone knew who Wood Green was. And that evening, we raised over $1.5 million. And they received another commitment after that for $4 million just in the first week of launching their campaign. So I would say the biggest tip for charities is to know your foundation, and you need to find your champions. If there's an alignment and passion, you will not only get donations, but you will get much further help because people really care. So it isn't just about the money. You need to develop the relationships with the charities, with the foundations, so they're willing to go the extra mile.
Thank you. Very, very informative and helpful. Hila, a question for you. We're changing direction a little bit here. Daniel's development often include green spaces to support community convening or community activities. Can you share how demographics influence the ways in which outdoor spaces can strengthen the diverse communities?
For sure. I'm going to go backwards for just a second because I think Crystal really, to me, touched on philanthropy 101, which is it's not about the money, it's about the relationships. And at Daniels, we've sort of started referring to that as engagement philanthropy. Like checks are good, engagement and relationships are even better. And when we talk about, things like gardens and convening outdoor spaces, one of the things, we have learned is how to bring folks of diverse backgrounds of different demographic groups together. And we've really narrowed in on sort of three, what we've come to call organizing elements: arts and culture, food and urban agriculture, and wellness and recreation. And on food and urban agriculture, we've really created that mandate in our Daniels developments, really starting from Regent Park 17 years ago, and now taking it on the road to all of our Daniels developments across the GTA, is bringing people together over food and gardening and incorporating garden plots in the outdoor spaces where we can in our development, realizing that by doing that, we're bringing people of diverse communities, even within a single building, together, because often food and or gardening go beyond some of those, demographic barriers, and create that sense of inclusion and belonging, where things like housing and affordable housing are a start. But we know ultimately what folks are looking for is that belonging and inclusion. And so doing that over outside spaces rooted in food, we found to be a really strong tool.
Thank you. And now on to Ray. Ray, cities are often the site for large-scale justice work. How do you see places like Toronto harness the power of the people to address changes needed in urban centers?
So it's somewhat ironic that I'm sitting here, as chair of Black Opportunity Fund, but I've chosen to focus my attention in this area actually around affordability, which has been the singular thing that's, I think, run through our conversations thus far. And I'm sitting with, essentially three builders, three developers. So, again, it's quite thrilling to understand some of the work being undertaken. Affordability at the end of the day is a huge and wicked problem, right? And we go back to some of the conversations from earlier on, which is there is no one single solution, first of all. There is no one single group from within the ecosystem that is housing that can solve this. This has to be a whole of community solution. And even then, you're going to be hard pressed to have one solution that applies across the country. What might work necessarily in the city may not work for a First Nations community or for someone living in a rural community. And what may work in Toronto may not work in Saskatoon. So I think you have to look at that first of all. So we go back to some of the things that Crystal had mentioned. I go back to the notion of collaboration, all three levels of government, and in particular, the importance of municipal governments when you hear about, the period of time required to go from, zoning to rezoning to building and then actually having something that represents a product. But so the builders, developers, the financiers, so the banks, the specialty finance firms, mortgage finance companies, and of particular importance, I will say the credit union system, which is often overlooked. The importance of the credit union system is really about the fact that they have traditionally focused on social impact as much as they have on making money, and they've been very geographic. And so I think that sort of historical component is super important. I referenced policy. So the policy wonks, as I, just very generously reference, super important in the conversation. But the biggest piece goes back to the notion of the impact of communities, those who we are trying to address the problem for. And quite often, they have perspectives, they have solution, but because they're not embraced into the conversation, their voice is not heard. So again, it's encouraging to hear that these types of dialogues are taking place. So to me, it's just really critical in finding solutions to affordable, supportive housing in Toronto communities, that those who live in those communities are engaged, involved in developing those solutions. Look, we see any number of examples of what that might look like. Parkdale Community Economic Development Project is a really good example of this principle. They have a network of probably 25, 30 other organizations and hundreds of community members collaborating to build decent work, shared wealth, and equitable development, more generally speaking. I heard reference to land trust, and I'm really starting to get myself a fuller understanding of something that's historically has been available, but could make so much more sense based on, again, what it is that we're being challenged with. So when I look at that, I think to myself, the democratization of land use and planning, for instance, appropriate strategies that really, as development is taking place, does not create displacement for those already there. So, maybe mitigating the sort of the aspects of gentrification. And look, there's nothing wrong with upgrading an area, but we also know the whole notion of NIMBYism will then kick in if you talk about mixed housing of any sort. So I think, you know, affordable housing strategies, the more I look, I believe, you know, it faces so much pressure. Whether it be actually from the real estate development, gentrification, there needs to be a balance that occurs to give, I think, more power to those with the least amount of money. And I think that sort of engagement is going to be super important. That attention to land ownership and its use, rather than just a sole focus on affordable housing. Obviously, that's it. But you know, that land use decision making, you know, is one that really needs to focus on what are the community needs. How do we prioritize that as part of the conversation? And again, I will make the statement. I honestly didn't believe that I would be hearing so many positive perspectives coming as it does from the other three panelists here. But it certainly left me, I would say, very engaged, you know, very encouraged, and really super happy and participating in this conversation.
Thank you, Ray. Appreciate your comments. I just got a note from the organizers here. We have no time for questions. However, people submitted questions when they registered. And in reviewing those questions beforehand, I think the panel has answered a good number of them. They've addressed the issues that were actually put out by people. So I don't feel too badly about that, because you're so comprehensive in your coverage and your discussion that you really addressed many of them. So having said that, you know, I'd like to thank everyone for their submissions here today in the panel. But before we leave, I'd like to ask each of the panelists to leave one message they'd like to leave the viewers with, or one takeaway from today's discussion. So if there's something you want to leave, some comments, some direction, please do so. And Ray, I was going to reverse the order, but since you just spoke, I want to give you time to collect your thoughts. I was going to have you first at the end, but let's go back to Andrea and go for our normal thing. Sorry, Ray. This gives you a little more time to think about it.
I began with words and I wanted to end with a word, and it's a new word I learned, inure. And it's when you get used to something unpleasant. And I think the risk when we live in any city is there's a chance we become inured to the housing crisis that we see in front of us. And I'm embarrassed to say that I catch myself when it almost happens to me. And it happened last month. I was with my 13-year-old son and I visited George Floyd Square. And I was nervous, I was curious, and I was embarrassed, right? As this woman, this white woman. And I felt like I didn't belong. And then this community activist came up to me. Her name was Crystal, I'll never forget.
Sure.
And she introduced herself and she talked about what it felt like to be her, what her experience was the day that George Floyd was murdered. And we're almost coming up to 3 years, May 25th, and what's changed. And so, you know, it was very, you felt an ache. And then she also talked about people living in a shed about 10 feet from where we were standing that were raising about 5 kids. And I admit that my heart did not ache the same way as it did for George Floyd. And then I realized they're not two distinct and separate issues. It's all connected. And so that message, I think, has to be just amplified when we're with government, when we're in our boardrooms, and when we're at our dinner tables. And so those of us in the industry have to say it even louder and make sure that what we are delivering, any chance we have to shape those communities, never forgets that.
Thank you, Andrea. Crystal?
I'll take a different approach because I got a lot of questions that were dedicated around philanthropy. So I just want to remind everyone that there are a lot of nonprofit organizations out there asking for funds to foundations and corporations. So be ready to be very clear and concise with your ideas and do your research. Know those foundations, understand what their mandate is, and make sure that they're aligned. And you want to partner with organizations that have the common goals and issues so that you can solve it together. And one final thing that I used to be very afraid to do was don't be afraid to ask. All they can do is say no, but if you never ask, you will never know. So don't be afraid.
Thank you, Crystal. Hila?
I'll follow up on Crystal's note just to say that this conversation reminded me that philanthropy is about time, treasure, and talent. And so we've talked a lot about the treasure being financial contributions, but when we look at philanthropy, there's really an opportunity to leverage the time and the talent that various communities, both on the community side, but also when we think of private developers, can bring. So really rounding out in our definition of philanthropy and what those not-for-profits Crystal mentioned can ask for. Yes, there's financial contributions, but let's go deeper than that. Let's leverage our networks. Let's leverage opportunities and bring them forward as a collective.
Thank you, Hila. And last but not least, Ray, you get the final word.
Look, I'm going to just reiterate some of what I stated. I honestly believe here in terms of what solutions can look like. And some of it has already been stated by some of the other panelists. But for me, it's the notion of a holistic, whole of community collaborative approach to addressing some of these issues along the way. That's how I see it, and that's how I honestly believe that we may have a chance of addressing all the different pockets of this thing that we reference as housing affordability that we have to deal with. And at the end of the day, that housing affordability, that shelter, represents so much about an individual sense of well-being around how they see the world, how they approach any number of things. And so if you can help solve for that, I think we have the chance to lift our society more generally speaking. That would be my takeaway.
Well, thank you, Andrea, Crystal, Hila, and Ray for being a part of this panel. It was a great discussion, incredibly informative and inspirational, gives us a lot of ideas and really sets a course for things that really need to be done and some hints of how to proceed. So it's been very, very fantastic. Also, a huge thank you to our lead sponsor for the Generous Futures Panel Series, TD Bank. Your leadership is truly commendable in funding this kind of panel. Thank you as well to our promotional partners, the Association of Fundraising Professionals, Canadian Association of Gift Partners, Planners, Canada Helps, Imagine Canada, and Community Foundations of Canada. Finally, please join us for our next Generous Futures event. We'll explore the role of philanthropy in protecting democracy. We've lined up an all-star panel for that one too. Everyone, thanks again. Have a great day and take care to everyone. Bye for now.
Thank you.
Thank you.